The rain had already started by the time the car door closed. 17-year-old Waverly Odom pressed her palm flat against the passenger window as her parents' silver sedan pulled away from the curb, and she watched it until the taillights disappeared around the corner of a street she had never seen before in her life. She was standing in front of a house she had only visited once, in a city she did not know, holding one duffel bag and the memory of what her mother had whispered to her before the door shut. "You have always been a burden to this family." Not a goodbye, not an "I love you, we will figure this out," just that. 7 words delivered in the flat, practiced tone of a woman confirming something she had decided long ago. Waverly did not cry, not immediately. She stood there while the rain soaked through her jacket, through her shirt, all the way down to her skin, and she stared at that empty corner where the car had been. Her aunt's porch light flickered on, the front door cracked open, and Waverly thought, with the kind of cold clarity that only comes when something breaks cleanly and completely inside you, that she was never going home. She was right. She would not go home for 11 years. But when she finally went back, she would not go back as the burden they had thrown away. She would go back as the woman they desperately needed. Before any of this, Waverly Odom had grown up believing she was simply unlucky. That was how she explained it to herself for the first 14 years of her life. Other families laughed at dinner. Other fathers ruffled their daughters' hair. Other mothers kept birthday photographs in frames on the mantel. Waverly was not unlucky in the way of poverty or illness. Her family lived well. Their home in Atlanta had 4 bedrooms, 2 cars in the driveway, and a reputation in their church community that her parents protected like a second income. Her father, Donnell Odom, ran a mid-sized logistics company and sat on the deacon board. Her mother, Sylvia, chaired the Women's Auxiliary and appeared in local magazine spreads about faith and family. From the outside, they were the picture of a blessed household. From the inside, Waverly was the thing that did not fit the picture. Her younger brother, Kellen, was her father's favorite in every way that mattered, meaning every way that was visible. Donnell coached his Little League games. Donnell drove him to school when it rained and picked him up when practice ran late. At the dinner table, Donnell asked Kellen about his day, his friends, his future. He asked Waverly to pass the salt. Her younger sister, Priya, was her mother's companion and mirror. They shared the same high cheekbones and the same precise way of moving through a room as though it expected it to rearrange itself around them. Sylvia dressed Priya in coordinated outfits and took her to every women's luncheon, every social gathering, every Sunday brunch. She never once invited Waverly. Waverly used to think she was simply not interesting enough. She was quiet where Kellen was loud, thoughtful where Priya was charming. She read too much and said too little, and the one time she had entered her school's regional art competition and won 2nd place, her mother had looked at the ribbon and said, "2nd place is still losing." She had been 11 years old. By 14, she had stopped entering competitions. By 15, she had stopped expecting anything that felt like warmth from either of her parents. By 16, she had started noticing the other things, the way her father would go still sometimes when he looked at her, not with tenderness but with something that looked uncomfortably like guilt, the way her mother would change the subject whenever anyone from the church asked about Waverly's eyes, which were a light amber brown that did not match anyone else in the family. The way old photographs from before her birth were never on display in the house, while photographs from Kellen and Priya's infancies covered an entire hallway wall. She had tried once, at 16, to ask her mother directly, "Mama, do I look like anyone on your side of the family? Because I do not think I look like Daddy's people." Her mother had set down the glass she was holding with a careful, deliberate click against the counter. She had looked at Waverly for a long moment with an expression Waverly could not decode, and then she had said, "You look like trouble, which has always been your problem." 2 weeks later, her father sat her down and told her she would be going to stay with her Aunt Renetta in Memphis.
He called it an opportunity for growth. He used a tone of voice that suggested the conversation was over before it had begun. Her mother stood in the doorway during the entire exchange and did not say a single word. When Waverly looked at her, searching for something, any small sign that this was a misunderstanding, Sylvia turned and walked down the hallway without looking back. They drove her to Memphis on a Saturday morning. Her father carried her bag to the porch and rang Renetta's doorbell himself. He shook Renetta's hand and said, "Thank you for taking her in." He did not hug Waverly. He did not tell her he loved her. He walked back to the car, and her mother, who had not gotten out at all, stared straight ahead through the windshield. Waverly had one last look at her mother's face through the glass before the car pulled away. Sylvia's expression was relief. Aunt Renetta was not a cruel woman. She was simply a tired one. She worked double shifts at a distribution warehouse and came home smelling of machinery and exhaustion. Her house in South Memphis was small and perpetually in need of something: a leaking faucet, a drafty window, a furnace that rattled through January nights. She had no children of her own and had agreed to take Waverly in, as far as Waverly could tell, because Donnell had offered to cover her grocery bills for the first 6 months. After the 6 months, the transfers stopped. Renetta never said anything directly, but Waverly noticed the way her aunt started checking the mail more carefully, and she felt the weight of that dependence sitting between them in every room. So Waverly made herself useful. She cleaned without being asked. She cooked on nights Renetta came home too exhausted to stand at the stove. She helped pay for her own school supplies by tutoring 2 girls in her 10th grade class for $20 a session. She did all of this quietly, without complaint, because she understood instinctively that her survival in this house depended on not being a burden. The irony of that word was not lost on her. Her parents called 3 times in the first year. The first call was her father, brief and formal, asking if she was settled. The second was her mother, asking whether Waverly had found a church to attend, which Waverly understood was less about her spiritual welfare and more about appearances. The third call was Kellen, who had clearly been told to make it, and who spent most of it talking about his basketball tryouts before saying, "Well, okay, take care," and hanging up. After that, the calls stopped. In her second year in Memphis, Waverly turned 18, and nobody remembered. She found this not with sadness exactly, but with a specific kind of confirmation that settled in her chest like a stone finding the bottom of a river. She had suspected, now she knew. She made herself a single cupcake from a box mix she found in Renetta's cabinet and ate it alone at the kitchen table while the television murmured in the next room. She thought about her mother's face in that car window. She thought about the word burden. She thought about how a word could be used like a blade and how some blades were meant to cut you free. She was 18 years old, alone in a house in Memphis, and she made herself a promise at that kitchen table. She was going to build something. She did not yet know what, but she was going to build something. That could not be ignored. The first piece she built was knowledge. Her high school had a computer lab that opened at 7 in the morning, and Waverly was the first student through the door almost every day. She taught herself graphic design through free tutorials. She learned video editing. She studied digital marketing by reading every industry blog she could find. She was methodical about it the way she was methodical about everything, not frantic, not desperate, simply consistent. 1 skill at a time, 1 hour at a time, long after the other students had gone home and the hallways had gone quiet. In her senior year, she started taking on small freelance projects. A local barber shop needed a logo, a woman from her church needed a flyer for her catering business, a teenager 2 streets over needed help editing a short film for a school project. Waverly charged modest rates and delivered work that made people tell their friends. By graduation, she had a small portfolio and enough saved to enroll in a 2-year communications program at a local college. She never asked her parents for a single dollar. There was a woman named Claudette Marsh who taught the second-year media strategy course and who had spent 20 years building brand campaigns for mid-sized companies before moving into academia. Claudette had sharp eyes and a direct manner that most of her students found intimidating. She called on Waverly 3 weeks into the semester to respond to a case study, and Waverly gave an answer that made Claudette put down her marker and look at her for a long moment. After class, Claudette asked her to stay. "Where did you learn to think about brand positioning that way?" "I read everything I could find," Waverly said, "for about 3 years." Claudette studied her. "Do you have work to show me?" Waverly showed her the portfolio on her laptop. Claudette scrolled through it without speaking for 4 minutes. Then she said, "You are going to work harder than most people in this program. You know that." "I already do," Waverly said. Claudette did not smile exactly, but something in her expression shifted. "Good, then you will be fine." Claudette became the closest thing to a mentor Waverly had ever known. She introduced her to industry contacts, pushed her towards freelance projects that stretched her skills, and told her bluntly when her work was not good enough, which Waverly found she preferred to silence. Claudette was the one who said to her once, during a late conversation in her campus office, "The people who underestimate you early are usually the ones who recognized your potential before you did. They were threatened. That is why they tried to reduce you." Waverly had looked at her and said, "What if the people who underestimated you were the people who were supposed to love you?" Claudette had been quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Then they did you a favor they will never fully understand, because you built something they cannot take away."
By the time Waverly was 24, she had built something. Meridian Creative Group was a boutique digital PR and media agency that she had started out of her apartment in Memphis with 2 freelance contractors and a client list she had cultivated entirely through referrals. She was 22 when she registered it formally, 23 when she landed her first corporate account, and 24 when she was profiled in a regional business publication under the headline, "Young Founder Redefining Brand Crisis Management in the Mid-South." She read the article once, saved it, and did not look at it again. She was already working on what came next. By 26, Meridian had 9 full-time employees, a second office in Nashville, and clients that included 2 regional hospital systems, a national retail chain, and a city councilman running for state legislature. Waverly had cut her natural hair close and wore it with the kind of quiet authority that made people in rooms pay attention before she had said a word. She dressed simply and expensively, and had the particular stillness of someone who had learned long ago that loudness cost more than it returned. She had not spoken to her parents in 6 years. She had not tried to. She had been careful about this, deliberate in the way she was deliberate about everything. She did not block their numbers because blocking implied emotion she was not willing to spend. She simply did not initiate. She did not send holiday messages. She did not reach out when she hit milestones. She did not send a photograph when the business publication ran her picture. She sent nothing, not out of bitterness, but because she had made a quiet decision that the people who put her out of their lives did not get automatic re-entry into the life she had built in their absence. But she thought about the question that had been living in her since she was 16 years old. Why? Not why did they abandon her. She had made a kind of peace with that part, or at least a working agreement. People who prioritized their image above their children's welfare were not mysteries. They were simply a recognizable type of failure. But why her specifically? Why not Kellen, who could be loud and careless? Why not Priya, who had her mother's sharp edges? Why Waverly, who had been quiet and studious and never, not once, embarrassed anyone? The answer came from a cardboard box in Aunt Renetta's attic.
Renetta had a minor stroke at 61 and spent 2 weeks in the hospital while Waverly handled her affairs. It was during this time, going through paperwork to find insurance documents, that Waverly found the box on the top shelf of the attic closet. It was sealed with packing tape that had gone brittle with age. Inside were letters, documents, and a photograph. The photograph stopped her completely. It showed her mother, young, maybe 25, standing beside a man Waverly had never seen before. They were at some kind of outdoor event, laughing at something, and the man had his hand at the small of Sylvia's back with the practiced ease of intimacy. He was tall, light-skinned, with sharp features and unmistakably amber-brown eyes. Waverly's exact shade. The letters told the rest. The man's name was Conrad Bellamy. He was, at the time of the affair, a rising political operative with connections to several Atlanta-area campaigns. The affair had lasted nearly 2 years. Sylvia had ended it when she discovered she was pregnant, and Donald had been told the child was his. The agreement between them, documented in a letter Sylvia had apparently written but never sent, was that the truth would be buried. The child would be raised as Donald's. Nobody would know. But children grow, features emerge, and Waverly had grown year by year into the face of a man who had never known she existed. She sat in that attic for a long time with the photograph in her hands. She did not cry. She thought about her mother's face the day she said, "You have always been a burden," and she understood finally what she had been a burden to. Not the family, the lie. She took the photograph and the letters. She put them in a folder. She placed the folder in the bottom drawer of her desk at home, and she went back to running her business. She was not ready, but she was patient. Conrad Bellamy was no longer a political operative. He was now the founder and chairman of a communications and public affairs firm that operated in 7 cities across the Southeast. He was worth, by all available estimates, somewhere between $40 and $60 million. He was on the boards of 2 foundations and twice had been mentioned as a potential candidate for state office, though he had never run. Waverly had known about him for 2 years before she made any move at all. She followed his career from a distance, watched his public profile, and said nothing. She was not ready for that conversation. She was not sure she would ever be ready for it. But she filed it away, the way she filed everything away, for the moment when the time was right. The time announced itself without her help.
Waverly Odom's logistics company collapsed under a federal investigation into contract fraud. The details emerged over 3 months in local Atlanta news coverage that Waverly read at her desk in Memphis, with the particular attention of someone who had been waiting, without consciously knowing it, for exactly this kind of gravity. The company had allegedly been overbilling municipal contracts for nearly 4 years. 3 executives had already cooperated with investigators. Donnell's name appeared in the 3rd article, then the 2nd, then the headline. His reputation, the one Sylvia had protected above everything else, was disintegrating publicly. The calls started 10 days after the first headline. The first one came from a number she did not recognize, and when she answered, it was Priya's voice, tentative and strange, with an unfamiliar softness. "Waverly, hi, I know it has been a long time." Waverly listened. She let Priya get through 3 sentences of uncomfortable small talk before she said simply, "What do you need?" There was a pause. Then Priya said, "Daddy is in trouble. We do not know what to do. Mom thought you might know someone." Waverly said, "I will think about it," and ended the call. Her mother called 2 days later. Sylvia's voice had a quality Waverly had never heard in it before, something brittle underneath the control, like a surface that had been kept smooth through enormous effort and was beginning to crack along invisible lines. "Waverly, I know we have not spoken in some time, but this family is going through something very serious, and families should come together during—" "I am going to stop you there," Waverly said. She kept her voice even and professional, the same voice she used with difficult clients. "I want you to understand something clearly. The word family is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and I need you to think carefully about whether it applies to me, given the last 11 years. Silence. If you need professional help navigating a public crisis, I can offer you a consultation. That is what I do. However, I will need you to be honest with me about the full scope of the situation. Can you do that? Her mother's voice, when it came back, was very quiet. Yes. I will be in Atlanta on Thursday, Waverly said. I will see you then. She arrived at her parents' house for the first time in 11 years, wearing a charcoal blazer and carrying a letter portfolio with her agency's letterhead. She was calm, the way still water is calm, which is to say there was a great deal of depth underneath. Her father answered the door. Donnell Odom had aged considerably, not just in the physical way of years, but in the way of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and recently dropped it in public. He looked at his daughter's face, and something moved across his own that he could not control. "Waverly," he said. "Mr. Odom," she said, and walked past him into the house. Her mother was in the living room. Sylvia had dressed carefully, which Waverly noted, because it told her something about what this meeting meant to them. Priya was there as well, sitting on the couch with the precise posture of someone trying to seem composed. Kellen had apparently not come, which Waverly filed away without comment. She sat across from her parents and opened her portfolio. "Tell me everything, from the beginning, leave nothing out." She listened for 40 minutes. She asked clarifying questions in the flat, focused tone of a professional who needs accurate information in order to do her job. She made notes. She did not express sympathy. She did not express anger. At the end of the 40 minutes, she closed her portfolio and looked at her parents. "This is manageable, but it will require full transparency and a disciplined response strategy. The story is already running. The goal is not to stop it. The goal is to control the narrative going forward." Her father leaned forward. "Can you do that?" "That is what Meridian does," she said. "What will it cost?" her mother asked. Waverly looked at her mother for a long moment. She said, "More than you are expecting, but less than you deserve." Sylvia flinched. It was very small and very real, and Waverly felt it land. She left her agency's rate sheet on the coffee table and walked out to her rental car and sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes with her hands in her lap. She breathed. She did not allow herself to feel the full weight of having been inside that house again, of having sat across from the two people who had put her out and said family should stay together with straight faces, of having watched her mother's expression when she finally understood that the burden was the one holding the rope now. She allowed herself one small thing, a single breath that she let out very slowly. Then she drove back to her hotel and got on a call with her team. The public reckoning came 5 weeks later, not as an explosion, but as a careful, controlled release of information that Waverly had been orchestrating with the precision of someone who had learned patience the hard way. It did not happen at a dramatic press conference. It happened in an investigative piece published by an Atlanta-area news outlet, a piece that someone had clearly provided significant documentation for, documentation that included financial records, internal communications, and a detailed account of how the fraud had operated. What was notable about the piece was what it also included, almost as a sidebar, almost as context, a reference to a decade-old cover-up within the Odom family involving questions of paternity that had apparently motivated a business arrangement and a long period of family estrangement. Waverly had not sent that sidebar. She had, however, arranged a conversation between a journalist she trusted with Aunt Renetta, who had known about the letters in that attic box for a long time and had been carrying that knowledge quietly, the way tired women carry things, and who had decided, at 61 and recovering from a stroke, that she was done carrying it. The calls that came after were different from the first calls. Her mother's voice had lost even the illusion of composure. Her father, for the first time in Waverly's life, sounded genuinely broken. "Please," he said, in a voice she barely recognized, "this family cannot survive this." Waverly sat very still on the other end of the line. "You destroyed this family," she said, "the day you told a 17-year-old girl she was a burden and drove away in the rain. Everything after that was consequence." She listened to him breathe. "I am going to finish the work you hired me to do, because I am a professional and I finish what I start. But I need you to understand something, Donald. You are a client. That is all you are to me now. If you want something more than that from me, you are going to have to earn it. And I am not interested in being convinced. I am interested in being shown, over a long time, with consistency." She ended the call. Conrad Bellamy reached out 6 months later through a mutual connection in the Atlanta business community, a carefully worded message expressing that he had recently become aware of certain information and that he would like to speak with her at her convenience if she was willing. She met him at a restaurant in Buckhead on a Tuesday afternoon. He was 61 years old and had the amber-brown eyes she saw every morning in her own mirror. He was composed but not entirely in control of his composure, which she respected. He did not try to explain or justify what he never knew. He said simply, "I did not know you existed. I want you to understand that. If I had known—" He stopped. He looked at the table for a moment and then back at her face. "I cannot fix what happened. I know that." "No," she said, "you cannot." "I would like to know you," he said, "if you would allow it, whatever that looks like for you, on your terms." She studied him. She thought about what it would have meant to have had this conversation at 17, at 20, at 23. She thought about the kitchen table in Memphis, and the cupcake, and the promise she had made herself. "I spent a very long time looking for a family. I looked in the direction of people who should have been that for me, and what I found in that direction was absence. So I stopped looking, and I started building, and what I built is mine. It does not need anything added to it to be complete." He nodded slowly. His eyes were careful and full of something she was not ready to name. "But," she said, "I am not opposed to beginning something, slowly, honestly, without any expectations on either side." He said, "That is more than I deserve." She said, "Yes, it is." She picked up her coffee cup and looked out the window at the Atlanta afternoon, at the city that had once held a house she had been driven away from in the rain. She had not been driven back. She had returned on her own power, on her own terms, carrying everything she had built, and she had stood in the rooms that were supposed to break her and let them see without saying a word about it exactly who the burden had become. She finished her coffee. She had a 3 o'clock call with her Nashville office. She had a new client proposal due by Friday. She had a team of people who depended on the company she had built from nothing, from $20 a session in a borrowed kitchen, from a 200-square-foot office that smelled like old carpet. From every single morning she walked into a computer lab before anyone else was awake and decided that the story her parents had written for her was not the one she intended to live. Waverly Odom left the restaurant and walked to her car in the afternoon sun. She did not look back. She never had to. Thank you so much for watching. Your support means the world to me. If you enjoyed the story, do not forget to like and subscribe for more.